Hello and welcome to Contemplations of the Lotus Eaters. I'm Hugo and I'm here with Josh.
Hello.
And today we're going to be discussing collectivism and how it relates to the individual and the psychology of it and all that kind of stuff. And so Josh is the expert here. So let's go.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to kind of have a definition and then point to some countries that kind of correspond to that. So the definition I've got here is that collectivism describes a form of social organisation in which an individual is seen as subordinate to a social collective, be that a state, a nation, a race or a social class. So the individual is seen as less important than the collective, which is a bit of a circular definition. I will concede, but
So with this definition, are we talking about a political system, a social awareness of some kind, or of individual approaches or mindsets?
well, this is going to be focusing on the psychology behind it. So it's going to be the individual and how they relate to society. But obviously, collectivism is both a social thing and a political view as well. And I'm going to kind of avoid the politics today and just talk about the actual individual's relationship with people around them and how this may differ in a collectivist society from that of an individualistic one.
I see. So when we're discussing what collectivism and individualism is, we're going to be talking about how people think of themselves in relation to others.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. And just so everyone's got a kind of clear concept of what individualism and collectivism are, it makes sense to see it as a bit of a scale in that you can be really individualistic on the one side and then really collectivistic on the other, and you can be somewhere in between. It's not a binary thing where you're either one or the other. There's a combination of each, and as you'll see in this kind of two-part series, it's probably not desirable to be too extreme on either side because there's some drawbacks and negatives that might not be very helpful.
We might want to add now that tomorrow we'll be talking about individualism, which will be the other half of this
Yes, of course.
two-part series, quote unquote.
Yeah, and in that individualism part, I'm looking less at the psychology, and we're going to be looking more at the trends of how individualism is kind of faring around the world and the implications of that, rather than focusing on the psychology like in this collectivist
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
So here we've got a map, and it has a very terrible title because it's from the Scientific American, but it's the best map I've actually been able to find. So
Okay.
This gives you a rough idea of the red countries that are the most individualistic, and the ones that are the darkest colour green are the most collectivist. So you can see China, for example, and that kind of part of East Asia, and then you've got parts of West Africa, and then kind of Central America there. And these are the areas that are more or less the areas of study for most of the research that exists. And they kind of break it into the three topics of East Asia, West Africa, and kind of Central America.
I like how there's no data for a lot of Africa. I can imagine it's hard to get data from some of those countries, and then just Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland. Sure. But what I'm interested in with this map is how it's defined. So is that basically the definition that you told us in the beginning? The collectivism describes a form of social organization in which an individual is seen as subordinate to a social collective, be that a state, a nation, a race, or a social class. So does that mean that the greener it is, the more it displays those characteristics, the more individuals are seen by kind of everyone or most people in that society as subordinate to some kind of collective?
Yeah. So, for example, you can see the difference between the United States and Canada there. The US being more individualistic and Canada being slightly more collectivistic, but on the whole more individualistic, and that seems to be reflective of both their kind of political differences and their societal differences. And I'm sure there are individuals within each country that think very differently, but as a general trend, these are things that they've extrapolated from various different forms of research. And of course, in portraying a map with various colours, you kind of lose some of the nuance of it in making huge general estimations about things, because I'm sure there's lots of variation between and within countries. For example, China, there's difference between the north and the south in terms of how collectivist they are. And I imagine that there's also differences in the UK, for example. I imagine that there'd probably be more collectivism in Scotland than there is in London.
Okay. So this map is just a generalization of that,
Yeah.
and generally it follows the definition that we mentioned in the beginning, that you mentioned in the beginning. Right. And so yeah, that's kind of interesting like that. I would be also interested in some of the other areas that are without data here. But
Yeah.
as you said, that's if the best you can find on this.
Yeah, to calculate this kind of thing, you need data on both people's practices and also their values and beliefs. And certainly in Africa in particular, you're not going to get many psychologists going around talking to lots and lots of people
I see.
about their practices, just because it's not really very practical to do so.
Yeah.
And it's not for lack of, motivation. I just think that there's limitations at the minute in what psychologists are willing to do.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
So, I would like to kind of have a little bit of a look at the kind of widely held view on collectivism, in that individuals are seen as having a greater readiness to cooperate and having kind of positive intentions towards other people. And you could see that in, say, someone promoting someone else's goals over their own to a certain extent. And I think this is generally the impression that people get when you talk about collectivism. This is the more positive interpretation of what it might be, isn't it? Would you say that's fair?
Oh yeah, I would say that's fair. If we're talking about the positives of it, like that would be something. If you want to present it favorably, that's what you would do. I think like altruism, wanting to help people, wanting to trusting them, things like that. That would be something that I would imagine under that kind of umbrella.
Yeah, and there's a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest that this is wrong, but I'm not going to spoil it. But there's also some of the research in this field is relatively young. I think it started off in the mid-90s. So in terms of how conclusive the research is, it's not comparable to many other areas, but I'm going to take a kind of closer look at some specific studies and kind of evaluate them based on their merits, and kind of have a little bit of a meta-narrative of how you can conduct studies in which actually measures what you're trying to measure, because I think the research into collectivism kind of fell afoul of some methodological issues, which some social science research certainly does, which is something I'm sure I'll discuss in the future. But I'd like to actually get onto the kind of origins of modern collectivism, and particularly in the West, it has its ties to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I probably butchered the pronunciation of his name. In The Social Contract, in which he argues that the individual finds their true being and freedom only in the submission to the general will of a community. And that's where it has its ties in the West, certainly.
Yeah, so like his idea of the social contract is very, like, it's famous today. It's something that basically everyone knows. But like we might want to mention that it's not like where collectivism started or anything like that.
Of course,
right?
yeah.
It's just where modern forms of it can be kind of traced to. It's a nice point which you can take as a representation of some kind of an origin, but then you also have like ancient societies, other societies that are kind of unrelated to the modern kind of Western states.
As I will get onto with when I talk about China, they kind of have much stronger roots back into history, and of course there are things that are just circumstantial that will make people more collectivistic, in that the circumstances make them forced to cooperate more. But
I just wanted to really kind of hammer the point that we don't think that collectivism started with Rousseau. It's nothing like that.
No.
I mean, even in Europe, for example, like you have Plato with his Republic, which is a very collectivist piece of work, and so it's something that has been here for a long time. Is something perennial. So it's not. When we talk about Rousseau, or when you talk about Rousseau, it's something that is just related to kind of the modern form, maybe of the state, or of how many people think about the societies today.
My main point in bringing it up is that it colours people's modern understanding of it, and that's the main thing I want to get at here. It doesn't necessarily shape the underlying behaviour of the people who live in these societies. I doubt that many people in China reading Rousseau just on a daily basis.
Yep.
So it would be a bit ridiculous to suggest that. And there's also links to Hegel as well, who argued that the individual only reaches their true being and ultimate freedom in total submission to the laws and institutions of the nation state, which Hegel viewed as the highest embodiment of morality. So that's a pretty concerning view.
That is a
to
concerning
say
view.
the least. And of course, Karl Marx as well, who would have guessed that he had a view on collectivism, also explicitly stated that social interaction is the kind of primary driving force in the formation of people's consciousness. And here's a little quote that I pulled out. It is not men's consciousness which determines their being, but their social being which determines their consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't agree with, just as an aside, because we can establish, for example, that there are lots of biological forces that shape how people behave, and also there are things in your development where it's perhaps strange to say it was a social thing, because your upbringing, it's not really an exchange of ideas. Sure, it's something external to you.
So to play the devil's advocate, would it make more sense to make the weaker claim that this social being is the strongest influence in your consciousness rather than determines it?
I mean, it's
Because-
something that's widely
Yep.
disputed, and
Yep.
I think it certainly has a significant impact.
Mm-hmm.
Like I couldn't put like a numerical figure on it, but it's not small.
Yep.
It's
So-
probably
so it's not-
something approaching a majority of the influence.
So
but
it's not like you would say that social class or social group has no influence on your development or on your thinking consciousness. Like, that's not the case, right?
Yeah, it clearly does have an effect,
Yep.
because if you were exactly the same biologically and you grew up in isolation on a desert island, you're going to be a very different person than if you grew up in wherever you are now. I mean, it's almost ridiculous to claim otherwise, right? So obviously, where your socialization has an important role, but it's not the be all and end all, as Marx might suggest. That's my main point there.
That one guy watching us from St. Helena is going to be really offended right now.
I don't know how many people are on there, so that's going over my head, really. So, collectivism kind of manifested in the West in the form of socialism, communism, and fascism. Of course, communism being the most extreme example, because they also believed in a highly planned economy and kind of had a view of the least amount of private property of those belief systems, but I'm not really going to get into that too much. But that's a form of collectivism, as many people would probably understand it. And
So that is when those ideas about a social setting or a social reality then gets translated into political action and constructs the political system in some ways.
I think in many ways, although I'm no collectivist by any stretch of the imagination, I think by linking it to that, I might be giving it a little bit of a disservice, because there are lots of countries that don't resort to such extreme political systems but are still collectivist. And I don't want people to think that ultimately being collectivist leads to just extremism and horrendous regimes and such. But
So it might be worth saying that you can have a collectivist mindset or collectivist people that think collectivistically, right? And it might not produce a collectivist political system. You might have a different political system if it's not democracy, for example. That political system might not be as aligned with what the people view in their own private lives as important, and so you don't necessarily have that tie. So you can have collectivistic attitudes, but not a collectivistic political system.
I would certainly say that the political system is somewhat independent of the people in which it governs, in that the people can have a collectivistic attitude but still live in a social democracy, and that it doesn't seem particularly inconsistent, because the people are just going to shape the direction of that system, aren't they? If it's working, which it seems like quite often they don't, but never mind. So moving on to kind of China and the East, the collectivism seems to be rooted in ideas from Confucianism, and this often focuses on one's relationship with those around oneself. And for example, the virtue of ritual, known as Li, is founded on the principle of practicing relationship between one another and acknowledging the power balance in that relationship. And I've only got kind of a relatively superficial understanding of Confucianism, but I understand that it's a lot about how one conducts oneself with the people around you, and it's more outwardly focused than developing the individual, like Taoism, which is one of my favourite Eastern philosophies, but I will probably have to get into that another time as well.
I can't really comment on this at all because I know virtually nothing about that. So I'll take you as an authority on this.
Taoism, I can't even say it. Taoism is great because there's loads of things that Western philosophy misses out on that Taoism kind of picks up, and it's very good if you're reading kind of the Western classics to then read some of the Eastern ones, and particularly the Taoist ones. And there are lots of things that I feel like Western philosophy misses out on that you can pick up from there. But that's a bit of a tangent.
Thank you for the recommendation.
That's all right. So I'd like to get on to how you can actually measure collectivism. And just as kind of an aside here, it might be worth saying that this measure didn't actually turn out to work out. And as I go through it, I'm going to explain why that is. And this is part of the reason why the research has been kind of hampered, because they operated for about 5 to 10 years under this method of researching, which ultimately was found to be inaccurate. So that the paper that came up with the measure that was widely used was called The Measurement of Independent and Interdependent Self-Construals. So you probably don't know what that means. So independent just means kind of your approach. So that's more of a collectivistic attitude. No, individualistic, getting them mixed up for some reason. And interdependent is another way of saying collectivistic, right? And a self-construal is just something that...
How you think about yourself.
Exactly, yeah. How you construe yourself. And that's relatively self-explanatory. And I actually did some research on self-construals while I was at university. So it is a concept that is tangible and pretty well established, but when it was applied in this case, I feel like it was perhaps not helpful. And we'll get onto that in a second.
Okay.
So this was devised by someone known as Singelis in 1994 at the University of Hawaii, and they kind of operated under the understanding that the two images of the self can coexist in an individual, which I think is perfectly reasonable. You can kind of have a combination of both individualistic and collectivistic attitudes. I don't see that as necessarily wrong, but they developed a 24-item scale where they asked a whole host of questions, such as, I feel good when I cooperate with others, and I like sharing things with my neighbours. And it was just a scale known as a Likert scale, where you have like strongly disagree, strongly agree, and they get points for agreeing or disagreeing with certain things.
So would you have the questions there were there? Would you have all those questions like that? So in your personal life, how do you feel about that thing or these relationship with the people around you? Or was it also political attitudes?
It was largely just aspects of their life. It's not necessarily trying to focus on politics, because if you kind of go into the realm of politics, things become a lot more complicated from a research perspective. And there's also the kind of view that if you're looking at countries where the political situation is unstable, they might not be honest with you because they don't want to disclose their opinions.
Point. No, but I think this is good that they do it like this, that it's just focus on that one thing and doesn't go into politics, which might muddle the waters a little bit.
Yeah, more often than not, when people are developing scales, what they might do is be as kind of laser focused on one aspect as possible, and then if they want to measure other components, they will develop other scales just so they can delineate each of the factors. And also if they find that some questions, say they're the ones that are measuring personality or their values or their practices, in separating that, you can see how these different things fluctuate and vary, whereas if you put it all into one, it's more difficult to pick out, because you've got to pick out, okay, this question's measuring this, and just from a practical research standpoint, it makes it easier when it's just separate and you can say, okay, you get a score for each of these.
Makes it easy to isolate and then pick
Yeah.
out what influences what and like play around with it.
And that's just something that I've kind of picked up from my research, is that a lot of the research designs are just more for practicality and ease for the researcher rather than any particular design choices, which I think everyone's guilty of to some extent. No one wants to make it more difficult than it needs to be.
It also, if you make it more difficult, you might be more prone to making a mistake. So
Exactly.
which you don't want to do. You want it to be a quality measurement, even if it's a bit adjusted to what you need.
Exactly, the simpler the better. So, can you actually see a problem with this yet, though, in the style of questioning?
Yeah, because it's clear that there is a good answer, and so people will want to answer the good way, right? They want to give the correct answer.
That is actually one of the things that they found, which I'll get onto later, that people were just, in certain cultures, were just more agreeable, and they'd be like, yeah, I agree to this, even though it might not be the case.
Yeah, and if you ask someone, do you feel good when you cooperate with others? Then obviously, like the overall feeling about the question, like when someone asks you, is like that's what she's supposed to be like. That's what she's supposed to do as the good thing, right? So you're saying yes because that means that you're a good person, and you don't want to think of yourself as a bad person, right?
Of course.
That's how, I'm not saying that's how everyone would view it, but that's how most people, I think, it would affect most people in this direction.
Although, to be fair, if I were asked whether I'd like sharing things with my neighbours, I don't know my neighbours. I don't share stuff with them. I don't know whether I'd get it
Can I
back.
have a question? Do they smell?
A little bit. So yeah, these questions. The problem is that the person is the frame of reference, right? So their responses to these questions are obviously measured, but then the person's responses are going to be shaped by their culture. So it's going to be difficult to find these differences between cultures, because everyone's assessing themselves based on how they relate to other people. So it's more useful as a measure within a country than between countries, because people assess how good they feel about whether they cooperate with other people based on things relative to the people they know. They're not going to think, well, relative to someone in a village in Africa, I'm pretty cooperative.
Right.
Although that's a bad example because they tend to be. But
So when they ask you, do you like sharing things with your neighbors? Then you might think, well, from the people that I know, from my friends, I'm probably the one least willing to share my things, so I'm probably going to say no because of that.
yeah,
Something like
but
that, right?
but also you could be in a group of friends which are really in favour of sharing stuff,
Yeah.
and therefore your perception is
Exactly.
going to be very different, and that is the problem, that it was very relative to the individual's perception of other people, which
And to
by
their immediate
definition is
surroundings.
shaped by their culture in the first place. And we'll see that in this subsequent research predicated on these measures, that this problem kind of persisted, and they weren't able to find some differences which to most people seemed obvious. Like you could just go on holiday, not as a data scientist, and you could see the differences with your very own eyes, and then these scientists were like, well, there are no differences here. And I think that's part of the reason why, because it's rooted in this measure.
Right.
And just as a little side note, this is something that is part of the reason why some research in the social sciences, which, by the way, psychology is not a social science. I'm sick to death of hearing this. Right? Psychology is
Calm down, no violence.
psychology is the study of the individual. Okay, sure, the individual can interface with society, but it's sociology, anthropology. These are the social sciences, and even social psychology to some extent. But like saying neuroscience is a social science is ridiculous. Like you're measuring the brain and like blood oxygen levels or excitement in certain areas. That doesn't seem like social science to me. But my prejudices aside,
Yeah.
I'll get onto some actual research. But whenever I get the opportunity, that does need clearing up because it bugs me to no end. So,
Sorry. Go on.
so studies started to reveal that people from different cultural backgrounds within the same country exhibited larger differences than did people from different countries. There are more differences within countries than between them, as I was alluding to earlier, which I think just from people's common sense, which is a term I also don't like, you would be able to tell that that's wrong, right? But operating with this measure, they weren't able to tell. So I've pulled out a quote here just from a paper that isn't very important because it's a load of rubbish, but this quote is good. The cultural differences between East Asians and North Americans that are assumed to exist by cultural psychological theory, the so-called common view, are not consistently apparent in cross-cultural comparisons of attitude, trait and value measures, yet there is considerable consensus among cultural experts from a variety of fields that the common view is accurate. And this is what I was alluding to earlier, that the research was finding things counter to pretty much everything else.
Counter to common sense.
Exactly.
Which I know you don't like.
I know, but that's a topic for another day.
Okay.
I've already gone on enough tangents today.
No, but I know what you mean, right? Like if something is quite obvious at first glance, you can't say that those things are the same. If there's an obvious difference that you can see, you can say that difference is not actually substantial, that it only seems like the difference is real and huge, even though the difference might be actually small and immaterial. But you can say something like that, you can explain it in that way, but you can't say it doesn't exist when you can clearly observe that it exists.
Of course. I mean, if you go to the United States or China, I imagine you're not going to say, you know what, this seems like the same culture to me. It would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? It doesn't make any sense.
No, I haven't been to China, so...
I haven't been to China either. I've been to the US, though. So, I'd like to look at this meta-analysis, which was called Rethinking Individualism and Collectivism, Evaluation of Theoretical Assumptions, and Meta-Analyses.
Right, and so the first one was from 1994, and this one is from 2002, right?
Yes, that's right. And it was by Usman, Kuhn and Kemmelmeyer.
Good.
And they were from the University of Michigan, and they compared the United States to other places pretty much. So they found that within the US, European Americans were found to be both more individualistic, valuing personal independence, more and less collectivistic, and feeling duty to the in-group less than others. However, European Americans were not more individualistic than African Americans or Latinos, and not less collectivistic than Japanese or Koreans. And this is where we start to see some of the problems emerging from these measures, because Japanese and Korean societies are kind of, in the common view, more collectivistic, aren't they? And to suggest that Americans are just as collectivistic as them seems a bit ridiculous, really.
So, the thing I'm seeing here is that they evaluated groups within the US, right, and and immigrants to the US, and so you might have a self-selection bias if you emigrate to the US, right? So historically, you would have people emigrating to the US who weren't happy in their home countries, who wanted to escape some kind of bad political situation, and usually they tended to be more individualistic. At least that's the kind of common knowledge, that they would want to go to the US to escape some kind of form of oppression or of unfreedom in their own country. And so in the US they would find more freedom like that, more space for individualism to be put into more practice, I think, or something like that. I don't know how to phrase it best.
That's a good point, though.
I wonder if that's what you can be saying here as well, that if you look at Europeans in the US, you're only seeing the Europeans that wanted to leave the Europe for the US.
Sure, and I imagine the culture which they brought with them, the culture of independence, would be taken with them and passed down. It's not like this happens out of nowhere. And you raise a good point in that if you're going to America in particular, you're going to have a very strong idea about what living in America is going to be like. And I think the idea from outside is that it puts a lot of emphasis on the individual.
Yeah, especially with that whole kind of romantic myth of the American dream and things
I
like
was
that.
just
right?
thinking of that, yeah. So moving on to some of the other findings of the research, among Asians, only the Chinese showed a large effect, being both less individualistic and more collectivistic. So you can kind of see that they were onto something a little bit, but they were kind of missing some stuff here in that it was kind of a blunt tool for measuring the actual attitudes here.
Right. And so when you say that, do you mean that what they found wasn't really reflective of what the common opinion is? Because I
Yeah.
don't think that's always a good measure, right? It's sometimes it can be indicative of it, but it's not necessarily the best, right? So if you're trying to establish whether a measure is good, you don't just want to see whether it conforms to common sense or common opinion.
There's subsequent research that goes against this, which is why I'm
Okay.
so
Sorry.
sure that this is very much wrong, because they kind of, the researchers that carried it out kind of acknowledged, okay, we've been operating using these strange measures that are kind of culturally relative, because you can't really assess your own position as an individualist or collectivist without considering the other people in your society, as we touched on earlier. And that's why they stopped using these methods in favour of other things as well.
Right. And so this meta-analysis just summarized the findings and the lack of conclusiveness of those findings of those previous studies, one of which we've mentioned from 97, right?
So I'd like to pull out a couple of quotes from here. The empirical basis for the conclusions is not as firm as might be desired, or as casual reading of textbooks in psychology would have the reader believe. It is hard to say whether cultural differences attributed to difference in individual or collectivist societies are generalizable across populations or regions, or whether differences found are limited to the countries studied in our meta-analysis. So even their conclusions were relatively kind of tame. They said, well, we weren't able to find as much of a difference as we would have hoped, perhaps, or had expected, and therefore...
And this is probably due to people comparing themselves to their immediate surroundings rather than to the whole world.
Exactly. So people started to realise that, okay, these measures aren't great, and started to look at other techniques. So you've got the case of Japan, where people implicitly compare themselves to other Japanese people, which lowers their estimation of their own collectivism. And this was a particular study, which I'm not going to go into too much detail, but they were looking at this problem in specific case studies of certain countries where they thought, okay, this is probably going to exist, but we just aren't measuring it correctly. Also, as you touched on earlier, further research suggested that some cultures are just more acquiescent, meaning that they agree more often. For example, they'll if you give them the question, I often do my own thing, and also, to me, pleasure is spending time with others. They seem at odds with one another, but they would agree to both.
Right. So that's how you would be able to tell that the measurement is not that good, because you would have seemingly contradictory things being reported, both in some way, and so it wouldn't be that it would contradict common sense the way you think about it, but it would be because it would show anomalies like this that shouldn't be there.
Yeah, and this actually led to the researchers adopting practices where they just measured how much people agreed with statements, and if they agreed too much or just seemed to say yes to everything, then they would be like, okay, this person's not very good, or they would change the structure of their questions so that it would be like framed both positively and negatively.
Right.
So you can kind of
so
switch
you
between
would
the
have two questions and aiming at the same thing, and one of them would be phrased positively and one of them negatively, and they would look at the results, and if the results reflected the framing more than the content, then they would maybe turn down the weight of the question.
That's exactly it, yeah. So I'd also like to make the point that in the case of I often do my own thing, it also means different things in different cultures, as I was saying earlier, in that if you're doing your own thing in America, maybe living in Portland with 10 cats on your own, whereas doing your own thing in China is probably just having a brightly coloured coat or something.
Yeah.
So the difference is going to be huge because it's culturally relative. A culture that places a high emphasis on individualism, your perception of your own individualism is going to be far lower than it might otherwise be.
And I would imagine that this research is quite difficult to do as well because of language differences. Because if you try to translate the questions and have the same question translated into a different language, you could have slight differences in the wording and the meaning of the words, in the connotations and things like that, which could skew the results quite a bit without you even realizing it if you don't have native speakers, or even if that native speaker maybe doesn't understand English that well or completely with the same connotations and same kind of background that you have, right? So these kind of things.
It's funny you should say that because when they're actually looking at these some past studies which seem to measure these sorts of things, they looked to a study by someone known as Yoshida, who was an anthropologist. He wasn't even a psychologist. He looked at Japanese rice farming villages, and he found that although on the surface it was seemingly collectivistic, in the village there were tight ties and they shared irrigation for water to kind of grow rice for, feeding their families, and it was necessary for them to be in harmony because they had to share resources to live. However, the kind of civil kind of attitudes to one another were only surface level, and that actually they found that, and I quote here, "Tensions lie below the surface, feelings run deep, grudges persist, but the surface of relationships are managed to exhibit harmony."
Yep. Yeah.
So it's also suggesting that the attitude here of collectivism may be false in that they are somewhat more hostile to one another because they are interdependent, with one another. And that is the kind of underlying problem here in defining collectivism as well, because you've got the cases where these people are clearly living in societies where they have shared goals, they have to share resources, they've got the shared irrigation, and this is required for them to grow food to live.
So they're kind of forced together in that way.
Yeah. And this actually creates more tension and conflict between one another. So rather than the kind of nice rosy image of, they're all cooperating and it makes everyone closer together and they have shared goals, it seems like perhaps things are a bit more complicated. And it also raises the question of whether if you're measuring people's outward attitudes, they're going to suggest things that are promoting harmony within their kind of neighbourhood, but maybe deep down they're concealing their disdain for other people because they're kind of conditioned to do so in their society, aren't they?
So they might be experiencing good things and bad things in their own community, but when they're advocating for something maybe nationwide, they're advocating for the good things, but they're concealing, as you said, the bad things, just because you don't want to admit that that's what's going on. It's something personal, but you do like the good things about it, obviously.
Yeah, of course.
If that's what you meant with that point.
Yeah, in that they were obviously they could recognise that collaborating was necessary for them to be able to grow their rice, and this was the most important thing probably to them, that having an income and being able to feed their families, it is less important than disputes between that sort of thing. So they understood the importance of it, but at the same time they didn't necessarily, they kind of resented their situation a little bit at the same time, if you know what I mean.
And so if they had these kind of personal problems in that community, would that then translate into them being higher on individualism on that scale? Or I don't really understand how that translated into the results of that study.
Well, it was an anthropological study, so they weren't using psychological methods. Okay. It was more observation and interview, which is the more social science approach.
Yep.
So it wasn't number driven, but nonetheless, I feel like it was reflective of things going on, because you're not going to pick up on stuff like that
And so they were not trying to put them on a scale between collectivism and individualism. That was not the point of that kind of study.
And it was also a Japanese researcher who would probably have some degree of cultural understanding of Japan because they'd grown up there. And in going to these villages, I imagine that perhaps if he was going there to study them, he probably wasn't from one of these villages, so they had an outsider's perspective. But as with a lot of anthropological studies, you need to take them with a bit of a grain of salt. But I think that they're probably getting at something here, because subsequent research seemed to find similar things, that people in collectivist cultures, in the kind of lay understanding of what collectivism is, actually showed these observable differences from individualistic cultures. And this is what I feel like these studies serve to illustrate most, that not only are these countries collectivist as people kind of expected, but there are traits in there that are counterintuitive to what you might expect, in that people were more suspicious of their neighbours and kind of more vigilant towards them, which I'll get onto in a second.
Okay.
So the next study I'd like to look at is a study known as The Cultural Grounding of Personal Relationships, Enemyship in North America and West Africa.
Enemyship. It's a funny word.
Yeah, so what it's actually looking at here is that people kind of maintained these civil, friendly relationships because they were dependent on one another, because they were in a society that operated in a collectivistic way, but they weren't necessarily friendly with one another deep down. So they maintained an air of civility whilst secretly not enjoying their company or what have you. So they compared Americans and people from Ghana, and Ghana being a country that is one of those West African countries that is kind of suspected to be quite collectivist. And they compared their kind of differing attitudes about how people interacted with them and whether their friends were secretly plotting against them, which sounds very sinister. And there's actually some kind of cultural heritage in this, in that there was a book in Ghana that's quite popular, which I'm going to absolutely butcher the name of, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's Kojo Gyanye Kie. Oh god, that was terrible. Which and the title is much easier to pronounce because it's just No Time to Die, which sounds like a James Bond film. But it essentially warned that your most intimate friends are actually at the helm plotting your downfall.
So it's a popular book in Ghana.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it although obviously what books are popular in a culture isn't exactly a good measure, but it goes to show, like, this book being popular in and of itself is not evidence, but at the same time it's kind of something that is nice, and it shows that, okay, if this book is popular here, it doesn't sound like something that would be popular in the UK, that, you know, everyone's out to get you and they're all plotting to... It would be perceived as a bit maladaptive, wouldn't it?
So, just imagining the Ghanaian Contemplations now doing in their studio and just talking about Americans and saying, look, they like NASCAR. Like, what does it say about them? I get your point, but it's just funny to imagine the river.
I think NASCAR's really great. I'd love to go and watch that, to be fair.
It's got some cultural baggage.
No, I think it's... Anyway, no, I'm not going to go on that tangent.
Next Contemplation is about NASCAR.
If only. Right. So they asked them a host of questions. First of all, they asked, do you have enemies? To which 48% of Ghanaians polled said they did, whereas in the US it was only 26%.
And so I assume they did make sure that they translated it well, because in the US that's a very strong word.
They actually framed the question slightly differently, so I'm using like a paraphrased version just for the sake of simplicity, but in the actual study themselves, they have comparisons of the differing questions, and I believe they actually ran it past people from that culture to say, okay, is this actually measuring what we seek to? And quite often when you're doing cross-cultural research, you kind of get someone from within that culture to help you out and kind of translate things, and any mistranslations kind of get worked out.
Yeah, I would imagine that that's a very obvious thing to know about, that you need to consider before you actually start gathering the data.
Yeah, and when I did my master's degree, although I'm not a social psychological researcher, they kind of went over the practices, and that's one of the things that one of the cross-cultural lecturers actually said. They were like, well, one of the main things you need to look out for here is that things get lost in translation, and just because you're a Western person, you think, you've got this great education, maybe the way you're framing your questions is really bad for what you're doing, and you shouldn't approach it with any arrogance, and you need to talk to the people and understand. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach.
Yeah, because if you take the dictionary translation of enemy to Ghanaian, and it might mean an opponent.
Yeah.
And an opponent is not the same thing as an enemy. It's got different connotations, got different weight behind it.
An opponent is someone you're supposed to compete with, whereas an enemy is someone who's hostile and
exactly
like plotting your downfall, as it alluded to earlier.
Exactly. And so if you take the dictionary translation, but it actually makes this bit of a difference. If there's this little bit of a difference in that translation, in that meaning, you get a large difference in what it actually produces and what people think about it. So that's what we're talking
Absolutely.
about. Yeah.
So one of the other questions was whether they believed that there were hidden enemies, and they were kind of targets that were abnormally suspicious. And I phrased that really badly. I'll try that again. So kind of would regarding having hidden enemies be something that is kind of worrying? Like, I would think they were paranoid. And,
Okay.
And in Ghana, only 9% of people said that this was something that they would be worried about and be a sign of paranoia, whereas 45% of people in the US said, yeah, okay, that seems a bit strong, maybe they are paranoid.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. It's a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think it's a very strange thing to me, because I'd be very much on the side of, if you think that people are out to get you and plotting, it's like almost like a symptom of some kind of neurotic disorder to me. Like, it's something that is a trait of schizophrenia, actually. Mm-hmm. That these people are out to get you and everyone's trying to work against you. And I think it must just be my psychological training here coming through, that it seems like something that wouldn't ever be useful to have. But I guess...
or narcissism.
Yeah. I suppose 91% of Ghanaians can't be wrong, can they? So, regarding no enemies as a target is foolish or naive. So, the question is, having no enemies is something that is both feasible and desirable. Mm-hmm. And, for example, they may say, okay, I think that person has lost their senses in trying to aim for this. 50% of Ghanaians said, okay, yeah, I agree with that.
So 50% of Ghanaians agreed that it's foolish to think that you have no enemies.
Yeah.
Okay.
And only 19% of people in the United States said so. Which I was actually surprised at how high some of these figures are for the United States, because I know it's quite just from a psychological perspective, there's high amounts of competition between people, but even so, in being individualistic, you don't really see people as being your enemies because you're more separated from them, if that makes sense.
You have more clear boundaries, so
you're
not as exposed to them because of those boundaries.
Yeah, you can kind of have the choice to avoid them if you wish, and therefore it's going to be less of a problem, and you're less likely to see them as enemies, because you can say, well, I don't like that person, so I'm just going to avoid them.
Yep.
And for example, 73% of Ghanaians also viewed enemies as inevitable when compared with 38% of the US. So no matter what you do, you're going to get some enemies, apparently.
Yep.
And when asked whether the model of the enemy relationship is a choice, so whether you choose to have enemies or not, 48% of those in the US agreed, but only 6% in Ghana.
That is a huge difference. Like this one. Like
And
if you choose to have your enemies, that's quite an important question.
That's like the crux of the individual collectivist difference, because it's about making choices, isn't it? And in individualism, choices are very important, whereas in collectivism, it's kind of less important because the individual is not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah.
And I think that's what that's reflecting here. So, Another study that I'd like to move on to is something known as in-group vigilance in collectivistic culture, which again compares Americans, but this time to China. So this was by Liu, Morris, Talhelm and Yang. So as you probably gather by the names, it was a collaboration of both people who were Western and Chinese.
And so this was from 2019, right? And
Yes.
so was this done in response, or did this address some of the shortcomings of the previous methodological approaches?
Well, it was kind of testing and building on why these kind of ideas about hidden enemies and such might exist and why it might be useful. And they also wanted to look at China, which is broadly speaking viewed as the most collectivist culture. So I'd like to read a quote here. So, we define in-group vigilance as social vigilance directed towards peers in one's group, such as classmates and co-workers. In-group vigilance is a social cognitive tendency to anticipate threat from in-group members. We argue that people in collectivistic cultures tend to perceive more competition in their social relationships. Because of this, we propose that they more readily impute negative intentions to in-group members.
So what that would mean is that people tend to develop tensions and conflicts with each other when they're in a collectivist setting, when they're somewhere where they don't have these boundaries between individuals.
Yeah, and I think that was what we were seeing in both Japan and Ghana, wasn't it? And that's kind of what they're describing here as well, in that based on the previous research, this is what we kind of hypothesized. And I think that I'm certainly on board with their interpretation. Having read through the research, it seems like there is something to this, and there is an adaptive reason to have these attitudes as well, which I'll get onto later.
I mean, it makes sense intuitively on some level, so
Yeah,
I'm not going to dispute that.
sure.
Just
So,
from a layman's point of view.
just to summarise their main finding, that they found that collectivist China were more likely than Americans to be vigilant towards in-group members, which at this point isn't really much of a surprise. And I'd just like to go through a few of their experiments. They did a few more, but I've picked out some of the more interesting ones just to talk about. So in their first experiment, participants were asked to imagine 2 or 3 possible behaviours for each competition scenario. It was either company employees competing for a bonus, students competing for scholarships, officials competing for a promotion, or actresses competing for a lead role.
Okay.
And they give a scenario, which I think it might be worth reading out. So they have either Mary, or the Chinese version, Wang Li, is an actress in a drama troupe. There is a new play in preparation. Mary wants to become the leading actress, but there are other actresses who also want the position. In order to become the leading actress, what are some things Mary might do? And then
so they have 2 or 3 possible behaviors that they can choose from, or...
Yeah, well, they also measured just their general responses, and what they did was they categorised them. This is somewhat subjective, so obviously take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, but they categorised their responses into ethical responses or unethical, in that would you use legitimate means, as in not interfere with other people?
Right.
So the ethical is, like, for example, do research on the role. So it's, do something to better yourself, whereas the unethical is poison the other actress's food or have sex with the producer. And these are the actual examples in the paper as well. So they must have
someone actually said poison other actresses' food.
Yeah, and
as in kill them, or as in like make them sick so they can't perform as well.
Probably make them sick, I imagine. So in
what can you do to get ahead? Just shoot them. That's not what we think. We do not advocate for violence.
I think people understand that at this point, but surprisingly,
it's still on YouTube at this point. So
surprisingly, only 62% of people in China said ethical responses. So that's a pretty significant. Like 38% said the unethical ways of getting ahead.
Yeah. And in the US, it was 16%, right?
Yeah. So 84% provided the ethical responses.
About twice as likely in China to say that the unethical response is something that they would consider doing.
Yeah, and that seems slightly concerning to me, but that's just me being a Westerner. Clearly, I don't understand. But they they actually looked at, they tried to break down the differences even more, and they theorised that there's a difference in culture between the North and South by whether people cultivated rice or wheat. And this sounds really counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It sounds like something that has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, well, it actually does. So in the South, people have to farm paddy rice for generations, and in the North, wheat was the dominant crop. So rice farmers had to coordinate irrigation networks and muster twice the amount of labour per hectare that wheat farmers did. And
Okay.
that's also similar, if you remember, to the rice farmers in Japan as well, in that they were quite collectivistic, in that they had to cooperate because of the large labour costs.
Right.
And the amount of work that goes into the amount of yield, and therefore they had to be efficient in their collaboration to make the most out of it because it's more difficult.
And so I imagine that they would measure some things on actual farmers, on people living in the countryside, and not on the general population here.
Sure.
Right.
But I think they also theorised that the cultural attitudes that originated from agriculture, which was still quite dominant in China, you know, up until the kind of more modern industrial revolution. So the cultural markers would still be there even if they weren't necessarily farmers themselves. But they concluded that because of the amount of collaboration, rice is a more collectivistic crop.
So rice is communist.
Yeah, I mean, we have objective proof that rice is basically a route to communism. That's fact, and no. Anyway, so...
You have to stand behind your point, be proud of it. Rice is communist. Say it.
I don't actually like rice, so rice is communist.
Okay.
Right.
Well, let's move on now.
With that fact out of the way. Okay. So, they posed them with similar scenarios as the previous one, and this is the difference between the rice and the wheat, remember? So,
Yep.
The ethical responses in the rice area, they represented about 59.8% of responses, whereas in the wheat, it was 64.5%.
Right.
So it's not quite to the same extent as the United States, but there's still somewhat of an observable difference there, right?
Was that significant? I mean, it's quite
Yeah.
small
I've only got, I only ever include significant results in my Contemplations episodes, don't you worry. I'm not going to be passive. I actually looked at all the statistical analysis of this just out of curiosity, and it was very good, actually. I was quite impressed.
Okay, good. No, it's just that it's quite small, so I was just asking just to be sure.
Yeah, that was in particular why I looked at it, because when the smaller the difference, the more the statistical difference has to be significant.
Yep. And
I think it was something like 0.0012, if that makes any sense to you.
Oh, yeah.
Normally it's to a threshold of 0.05.
Yep.
That's a bit of data science and statistics for you. You don't need to worry about that. But in terms of the unethical responses, about 17.7% of the rice farmers came up with that. I shouldn't say farmers, but people from the rice areas. Yep. And 16.3% said so in the wheat. So that's quite a small difference. However, in the grey areas, 22.5% in the rice had kind of morally grey, where it wasn't really ethical or unethical.
Right.
And then the wheat farmers, it was 19.2%.
Right. And so before, when I said that the Chinese compared to the Americans are twice as likely to say that the unethical response was fine, more or less, that was probably wrong, because I forgot about the grey area that I didn't know about before that. And so there's this grey area, so that conclusion would be wrong.
I don't think it came into it in the first scenario. I think they looked at it slightly different in this one.
Okay.
Otherwise, I would have included the grey area.
Oh, okay.
Don't worry. So, I'd like to read out a little quote from what they say here. Collectivistic cultures harboured more in-group vigilance than individualistic cultures, both between country comparisons between China and the US, and within country comparisons between both the rice and the wheat regions within China. The results suggest that in-group vigilance is partially caused by stronger perceived within-group competition in collectivistic cultures. So it's this picture that seems to be forming from some of this research that when people are kind of forced together and to cooperate more, that it creates more vigilance to one another and perhaps more resentment as well.
So they might be forced together through political means or through natural means, like forced together by the forces of nature, by the constraints of nature, to kind of work together to survive or thrive in some ways.
Sure.
Okay.
And they did add that China did go through the Cultural Revolution, which obviously had the effect of pitting neighbours against one another, which would clearly have like a lasting influence on people's thoughts and their opinions and behaviours towards one another. And they said that perhaps it's not a relic of these collectivist attitudes per se, but just the historic kind of tragedies, I guess it's fair to say, that occurred in China, because the Cultural Revolution is truly awful. And I only started reading about it recently, and I couldn't believe how bad it is. It's like reading the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, in that I just can't believe how people can be so cruel to one another. And it's just like, wow, this is clearly going to have some effect as well. And it may be adaptive that these people have these suspicions of their neighbours when you have this kind of history within your culture.
Yeah, it's not that long.
No, it was, wasn't it in the 1950s or something like that? And just to kind of conclude, I'd like to quickly go over some other findings as well. People in more collectivist cultures agree with we should keep our ageing parents at home. So another marker of collectivism is that they take care of their kind of their grandparents, their parents, and they're more likely to have them living with them in their home, which I think is just something that people can anecdotally observe, in that people in Japan and China are more likely to take good care of their older generations, aren't they? And also that people living in collectivist cultures report less intimacy with their friends, but are also more likely to believe that they stick together in tough times. And I think that might be part of the vigilance sneaking in there, in that they feel like they have to have some guard up between them.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of last bits of research I would like to go over. But what are your kind of final thoughts here? Because this is obviously quite counterintuitive, in that people in collectivist cultures are actually, on the whole, more vigilant and perhaps secretly hostile to one another underneath the surface.
I think I would. That's something that is intuitive for me as well. I tend to agree with that intuitively, just because it makes sense for me to see it like that, to perceive the fact that you have to have barriers somewhere to maintain your composure in some ways. And so those barriers can be quite clearly drawn between individuals, or they can be, kind of smudged. And if they're a bit smudged, then you have to cope with it in some ways. And the way that you're going to cope with it is just by some internal mechanisms or other ways that might not be as practical, right? And so I would see something like that. That makes sense to me, like what you research that you just mentioned.
And I was relatively surprised by this, actually, in that I thought, okay, well, surely there's got to be some trade-off with collectivism, in that sure, you have these closer ties, but you tend to have less freedom. And as someone who values freedom above many other things, I was just like, well, I'm not willing to make that trade-off in the first place, so it doesn't really matter. But then when I actually looked at it, and they don't actually have these closer, more intimate ties with one another, then I kind of think, well, is this really something that is desirable at all for anyone? Because if you're really vigilant and suspicious of your neighbours, then what's the point in collaborating with one another if you're only going to be more and more kind of resentful of it?
So you would say that because these proverbial benefits of it aren't actually there, then maybe collectivistic cultures are just held together either by necessity or by obligation.
Yeah, I could certainly see that, particularly in China, as we'll get on to tomorrow. Some of the research seems to find that China is a weird anomaly where all of the markers of more individualistic cultures are kind of there. It's just that it bucks the trend when compared with every other country. And I think the unique nature of their kind of totalitarian government seems to promote this thing which might not actually otherwise exist.
Right. So there is a discrepancy between the political system and the attitude of the population.
Yeah, perhaps. Okay. And I suppose I may as well spoil a little bit of the findings for tomorrow, that they found that individualism seemed to relate very strongly to socio-economic development. And obviously China's quite developed when compared with places in Africa, but it's also more collectivistic, which doesn't seem to follow the trend.
Politically, you would say, or socially?
Economically developed, but...
No, collectivistic, whether politically...
Yeah, socially, sorry.
Socially, okay.
So yeah, the political force is compelling society to be this way.
Right.
And it may not otherwise be that way.
Okay, that's interesting, and we'll get more into those types of things tomorrow. So thank you for watching, and if you like this episode, you can watch all of the other episodes at lotuseaters.com, and if you want to support us, if you like this really a lot, then you can become a premium member and enjoy all our premium content as well at lotuseaters.com. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.
Goodbye.